The winter of 1953 pressed down on Moscow like a heavy iron lid, trapping the smoke and secrets beneath a sky the color of old steel. In a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city, where snow gathered in the corners of barred windows and guards stamped their feet against the cold, a young woman sat strapped to a chair in a room painted the institutional green of Soviet authority. Her name was Tatiana, and she had volunteered for something the doctors would not fully explain. They had promised her extra rations, a warmer dormitory assignment, and the pride of serving the motherland in ways that ordinary citizens could never understand. What they had not told her was that she would spend the next 72 hours without sleep, subjected to lights that never dimmed and sounds that cycled through frequencies designed to unmake the architecture of her mind. The program had a code name that meant nothing to her, Laboratory 12. The scientists who moved through those corridors wore white coats that seemed to glow in the fluorescent glare, and they carried clipboards filled with notations in a terminology borrowed from Pavlov but twisted into something darker, something that would have made even that pioneer of conditioned reflexes pause with concern. They were searching for the breaking point of human consciousness, the exact moment when a person's sense of self could be dissolved and reformed like clay in the hands of a sculptor. The Stalin era demanded such knowledge. In a world divided between two ideologies, each racing toward nuclear supremacy, the human mind had become another frontier to conquer, another weapon to forge in the cold fires of scientific ambition. Tatiana's eyes burned. She tried to focus on a spot on the wall, but the lights shifted in intensity, pulsing in patterns that seemed almost alive. A voice spoke through hidden speakers, reciting passages from Lenin, then switching without warning to nursery rhymes from her childhood, then to strings of numbers that meant nothing yet embedded themselves in her thoughts like splinters. Hours folded into one another. She lost track of time, lost track of which thoughts were hers and which had been planted by the relentless audio assault. When she finally broke, weeping and calling out for her mother, the scientists made careful notes about the precise duration and methods employed. She was one of dozens. Some would recover. Others would carry the scars invisibly for the rest of their lives, never quite whole again, never quite able to explain what had been taken from them in those rooms where science wore the mask of patriotic duty. But sleep deprivation and psychological torture were only the beginning of the Soviet Union's journey into the forbidden territories of human experimentation. As Stalin's death approached and then arrived, the programs did not end, they evolved, spreading like roots into deeper, stranger soil. In facilities scattered across the vast expanse of the USSR, from the Baltic states to the steppes of Kazakhstan, from the forests of Siberia to the closed cities that appeared on no civilian maps, scientists pursued knowledge that existed in the shadows between legitimate research and something far more troubling. In Leningrad, in a laboratory connected to the Institute of Experimental Medicine, a team led by a researcher named Sergei Brukhanenko had already, years earlier, achieved something that seemed to defy the boundary between life and death. In the 1930s, Brukhanenko had developed a primitive heart-lung machine, a device of tubes and pumps that could maintain isolated organs in a state of artificial life. The experiments that followed became the subject of whispered stories among medical students, tales too disturbing to be fully believed yet too specific to be entirely dismissed. A dog's head, severed from its body, was kept alive by Brukhanenko's machine, its eyes following movement, its tongue responding to stimuli, a grotesque puppet of flesh and nerves sustained by the mechanical rhythm of pumps circulating oxygenated blood through vessels that should have been cold and still. The film footage existed, grainy and unsettling, shown to select audiences of scientists and military officials. In those images, the head sits on a platform surrounded by glass tubes filled with blood, and when a technician taps the table, the eyes react, tracking the source of the sound with an alertness that suggests something more than mere reflex. The question that hung over such experiments was not whether they could be done, clearly they could, but whether they should be done, and what such knowledge might mean for a state that viewed its citizens as resources to be optimized and, if necessary, expended. Brukhanenko's work was presented as a triumph of Soviet medicine, a step toward understanding the mechanisms of resuscitation and the preservation of life. But beneath that official narrative lurked darker possibilities, the shadows of a regime that saw human beings as subject to the same principles of mechanical manipulation as any other machinery of state. The years after World War II brought a new urgency to Soviet science, a desperation born of the Cold War's relentless pressure. The Americans had the atomic bomb, then the Soviets had it too, and the race was on for dominance not just in weapons but in every conceivable arena where one superpower might gain advantage over the other. Psychology became militarized. Biology became a battleground. And in the pursuit of these new frontiers, ethical boundaries that might have constrained researchers in other times and places simply dissolved, replaced by a utilitarian calculus that weighed individual suffering against the collective interests of the Soviet system. In the closed city of Novosibirsk, where the Scientific Academy maintained research facilities of such sensitivity that visitors required multiple layers of clearance, biochemists explored the outer limits of human endurance through chemical means. They synthesized stimulants that could keep soldiers awake and alert for days at a time, accepting the inevitability of psychotic breaks and cardiovascular collapse as acceptable prices for temporary enhancement. Phenotropil and other compounds emerged from these efforts, drugs that could sharpen focus and delay fatigue, but which carried with them the risk of addiction and the certainty of devastating crashes when the artificial energy finally ran out. Test subjects, sometimes volunteers from military units, sometimes prisoners who had no choice in the matter, were pushed to the edge of human capacity and then pushed further, their bodies and minds treated as laboratories for the refinement of performance enhancement. But the Soviets also pursued stranger paths, investigations that seemed to blur the line between science and something closer to science fiction. In Moscow, in a division of the KGB known as Department 8, researchers explored the possibilities of parapsychology, convinced that the human mind might harbor powers that Western science had overlooked or dismissed as superstition. Remote viewing, telepathy, psychokinesis, these were not the subjects of idle speculation but of serious, funded programs that continued for decades, through the Khrushchev years and into the Brezhnev era and beyond. Scientists with impeccable credentials conducted experiments designed to detect and measure extrasensory perception, searching for gifted individuals who might be able to perceive events at a distance or influence physical systems through thought alone. The rationale was both defensive and offensive. If the Americans were investigating psychic phenomena, and intelligence suggested they were, then the Soviets could not afford to fall behind in this arena any more than they could in missile technology or space exploration. And if such abilities did exist, even in rudimentary form, they represented a potential weapon of extraordinary subtlety, a way to gather intelligence or influence events that would be virtually undetectable and completely deniable. The experiments were often crude by the standards of rigorous science, plagued by methodological flaws and wishful thinking, but they continued because the possibility, however remote, was too tantalizing to abandon. In darkened rooms, subjects attempted to transmit images to receivers in distant locations. Sensitive instruments were monitored for any hint of mental influence over random number generators or the trajectories of falling objects. Skepticism was present but always subordinate to the imperative not to be caught unprepared if consciousness truly did harbor hidden dimensions of power. By the 1960s, as the space race captured the world's imagination and Soviet cosmonauts became heroes of socialist achievement, other programs remained hidden, their goals too disturbing or too speculative to acknowledge publicly. In facilities dedicated to aerospace medicine, researchers studied the effects of extreme isolation on human psychology, confining subjects to sealed chambers for weeks or months at a time, monitoring the deterioration of their mental states under conditions that simulated the loneliness of space travel. Some emerged traumatized, haunted by hallucinations that did not fully recede even after their return to normal life. The data gathered from their suffering informed the design of spacecraft and the selection criteria for cosmonauts, but it also fed into psychological warfare research, into understanding how isolation and sensory deprivation could be weaponized against prisoners and enemies of the state. The Soviet program of forced psychiatry, which reached its peak during the Brezhnev years, represented perhaps the most systematic abuse of medical science for political ends. Dissidents who challenged the system, intellectuals who spoke too freely, religious believers who refused to renounce their faith, these individuals were often diagnosed with schizophrenia or sluggish schizophrenia, A diagnosis that existed nowhere else in the world's psychiatric literature but which provided a convenient pretext for indefinite confinement in psychiatric hospitals where treatment was indistinguishable from punishment. High doses of antipsychotic medications were administered not to heal but to pacify, to break the will and cloud the mind. Insulin shock therapy and other brutal interventions were employed not because they were medically indicated but because they were effective tools of psychological destruction, ways to transform defiance into docility, to make an example of those who dared to think differently. The doctors who participated in these programs were not sadists, or at least not all of them. Many genuinely believed they were serving a higher purpose, that the stability of the Soviet system justified extraordinary measures, that individuals who challenged the collective wisdom of the party must, by definition, be suffering from some form of mental illness. The ideology of Soviet psychiatry held that a truly sane person would recognize the superiority of socialism and embrace the guidance of the state. Dissent became pathology, and treatment became re-education through chemistry and confinement. The victims of this system numbered in the thousands, their stories emerging only gradually after the fall of the USSR, testimonies of years lost in institutions where the distinction between hospital and prison had collapsed entirely, where the white coat of the physician had become as feared as the uniform of the secret police. Yet alongside these abuses, Soviet science also pursued projects of genuine innovation and even moments of ethical clarity that complicate the narrative of unrestrained experimentation. In the field of neuroscience, researchers like Alexander Luria conducted groundbreaking work on brain function and cognition, developing methodologies that advanced understanding of how injury and disease affect mental processes. Soviet mathematics and theoretical physics produced work of profound importance, contributing to fields from topology to quantum mechanics. The space program, despite its propaganda value, represented real scientific achievement, the culmination of engineering and research that put the first satellite into orbit and the first human into space. The tension in Soviet science was not between good and bad researchers but between a system that demanded both excellence and obedience, that rewarded innovation while punishing independence, that could produce genuine breakthroughs while simultaneously conducting experiments that violated the most basic principles of human dignity. Scientists worked within this contradiction, many of them navigating a treacherous path between the desire to advance knowledge and the necessity of serving a state apparatus that did not tolerate questioning or dissent. Some managed to do important work while avoiding complicity in the darkest programs. Others found themselves drawn into projects that they might have rejected in different circumstances, their choices constrained by the realities of life in a totalitarian system where refusal could mean professional destruction or worse. The military applications of Soviet research extended into domains that seemed almost fantastical. Efforts to develop chemical agents that could induce fear, confusion, or temporary incapacitation led to the synthesis of compounds like colocol-1, a derivative of fentanyl that would later be used with tragic consequences during the Moscow theater hostage crisis of 2002, long after the fall of the USSR, a legacy of Cold War weapons research that outlived the conflict that spawned it. The Soviets investigated acoustic weapons, systems that could generate infrasound at frequencies below human hearing but capable of inducing nausea, disorientation, and panic. They explored the military potential of biological agents, maintaining research programs that paralleled similar efforts in the United States, each side justifying its work as defensive while developing capabilities that were unmistakably offensive in nature. In the closed cities of the Soviet biological weapons program, facilities like Vector in Koltsovo worked with pathogens of terrifying lethality. Smallpox, anthrax, plague, these ancient scourges of humanity were cultured and weaponized, transformed into agents of warfare that could, in theory, be delivered by missile or aircraft, spreading death on a scale that dwarfed conventional weapons. The scientists who worked in these programs lived in a state of controlled paranoia, aware that a single accident could trigger an epidemic, that the viruses and bacteria they manipulated in sealed laboratories represented existential threats not just to enemy populations but to their own communities. Safety protocols were rigorous, but the inherent danger could never be entirely eliminated. The knowledge that they were working with weapons capable of killing millions weighed on some researchers. while others rationalized their work as necessary deterrence, believing that the existence of these capabilities prevented their use through the logic of mutual assured destruction. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 brought many of these programs to light, though much remains classified or lost in the chaos of the transition. Scientists who had worked in the most sensitive facilities found themselves suddenly without funding, without purpose, in a new Russia that had little use for the specialized knowledge they had spent careers developing. Some defected to the West, bringing with them secrets that intelligence agencies had sought for decades. Others simply tried to survive, their expertise in Soviet-era biological weapons or psychological warfare operations becoming a liability in a world that wanted to move beyond the Cold War's paranoid logic. The archives gradually opened, revealing the scope of programs that had operated in complete secrecy. Documents emerged describing experiments that confirmed the worst suspicions and revealed others that had never been imagined. The scale of human testing, the casualness with which research subjects were exposed to dangerous procedures, the systematic nature of scientific abuse, all of it came into focus as historians and journalists sifted through the debris of the fallen empire. Yet even now, decades after the USSR's dissolution, questions remain. How many programs existed that left no paper trail? How many subjects suffered without their stories ever being recorded? What knowledge was gained that remains locked in classified files or forgotten in decaying research? Facilities scattered across the former Soviet territories. The legacy of Soviet forbidden science is one of profound ambiguity, a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge is never truly neutral, that science conducted in the service of totalitarian ideology becomes complicit in that ideology's crimes, even when individual researchers might have convinced themselves they were serving higher purposes. The experiments conducted in those decades produced data that sometimes advanced medical understanding, and they also produced trauma that reverberated through the lives of thousands who were subjected to procedures they never fully understood or consented to in any meaningful sense. The machinery of the Soviet state treated its citizens as resources to be exploited, and science became one of the tools of that exploitation, dressed in the language of progress and patriotic service but operating according to a logic that subordinated individual human worth to the presumed needs of the collective. In the end, the story of Soviet forbidden science is a story about power and its corruption of human endeavor, about how even the noblest impulse, the desire to understand the world and alleviate suffering, can be twisted into something dark when it operates without ethical constraints, without transparency, without accountability to anything beyond the demands of the state. The scientists who participated in these programs were not monsters, which is perhaps the most troubling aspect of the entire history. They were ordinary people working within a system that normalized the abnormal, that made cruelty seem reasonable and violation seem necessary. Their legacy endures as a warning about what science can become when it loses sight of the fundamental principle that knowledge must serve humanity, not subjugate it, and that no collective goal, however noble it might appear, can justify the systematic abuse of individual human beings in the name of progress.